Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to this talk today on Left in the Midwest. We have one of the volume's co-editors with us and four of the authors who I will let Ben do the introductions of that. But to introduce Ben Looker, he is an associate professor of American Studies at St. Louis University. He has a PhD in American Studies from Yale University, and some of his other authored works include A Nation of Neighborhoods, Imagining Cities, Communities, and Democracy in Post-War America, which was the recipient of some awards by the American Studies Association and the Urban History Association. He and Amanda Lizzo, who is also an associate professor of women and gender studies at St. Louis University, they co-authored this volume, Left in the Midwest, which is available now in both hardback, paperback, and ebook. And I am delighted to welcome Ben here to talk about four of the authors who contributed chapters to this book. So I'll turn it over to you, Ben.
Well, great. Thank you so much. I just want to say about 5 minutes here about the volume as a whole before I go on and introduce the distinguished scholars who are here with us. So I'm extremely excited by this invitation. I'm so grateful to Miranda Rechtenwald for proposing this and setting it up. It's one of several events this semester about this anthology that's just been released. We had one from WashU's American Culture Studies program in January. There's one coming up in 2 weeks at St. Louis University that's in person and will feature 4 different authors from the collection, as well as a group of 4 activists whose work is discussed in the collection. So you're welcome to be part of that one in 2 weeks. And we found when you have 19 contributing authors to a volume like this one, there can be many events with completely distinct lineups of speakers. So we hope that we'll see you at other events as well. But my co-editor and I were especially pleased about this invitation because WashU Special Collections was absolutely integral to the project. So unlike the other ones, this is an invitation from people who've been partners the whole way through. Numerous of our authors worked with materials at Special Collections at Washington U. And also the volume has 95 images. We were working hard to convey some of the texture of the era visually. And numerous of those key images come from Washington U's special collections, facilitated by Miranda's expertise and her help. So thank you. I'm also delighted about this event because of the stature and importance of the 4 panelists as truly significant researchers and interpreters of US history and culture. All of them have major books or documentary films that have enriched and reshaped understandings of how power and resistance operate in the US past and present. So let me say just a couple words about the anthology, maybe 5 minutes worth, the anthology in which these distinguished scholars have chapters. And here I also want to acknowledge the central role of my co-editor, Amanda Izzo, an associate professor in women's and gender studies at St. Louis U, who did an immense amount to make this happen also. But as we kind of conceptualized this volume, which we did late in 2019, one of the tasks that we took for ourselves as we issued invitations and sought to put together a really dynamic collection of work was to put into conversation research being done on the plethora of progressive-oriented social movements that took root in this single city during a 2-decade span. Civil rights, various strands of feminism, lesbian and gay liberation, the anti-war, the environmentalist causes, and on from there. And that led us to our 19 authors and 16 contributions covering this span. And I think to do that allows us to ask about intersections and about coalition building, or sometimes lack thereof, about similarities and differences, about hierarchies and access to power between different movements and initiatives in new kinds of way. And I think the time seemed great for doing this because of the direction scholarship on St. Louis has gone. Now, there already was existing a super vibrant body of work on the local Black freedom struggle, including earlier foundational works by figures like Ernest Patterson and, of course, George Lipsitz. But these have been joined over the last 15 years or so by groundbreaking scholarship by Clarence Lang, who's with us today, by Kiana Irvin, who is another volume author, and others. But also my co-editor and I noticed that there were increasing numbers of projects ongoing that sought to analyze the contours of anti-war, feminist, labor, queer, and environmental thrusts in this metropolitan setting. And in fact, our host, Miranda Rechtenwald, with the project mapping LGBTQ St. Louis, is just an outstanding example in the digital humanities and public humanities sphere of that kind of work. And so what had been published was far-flung in terms of venue. what had been published in these areas was sometimes hard for a non-academic audience to find and access. And yet a lot of it was burbling through the research process. Some had seen the light of day and some hadn't. So there are many resources out there, and we saw an opportunity to bring those together. So creating a broad-ranging collection about this era and the sweep of progressive organizing projects had really just become possible in a way that it wouldn't have been a couple of years earlier before some of these projects got underway. And we hope not just the 16 essays, but really the juxtaposition of the essays can open up new conversations and questions. Now, if bundling together these far-flung examples of terrific and exciting new and old scholarship was one task. A second task for us that was really central was doing scholarship or facilitating it that centers local spaces, communities, cultures, neighborhoods, and institutions in how we think about activism of the 60s and 70s. Now, we've probably all seen this, but I think there's a particular vernacular way of thinking about, quote unquote, the 60s that understands movement building pretty much exclusively through the lens of national politics, national events, what different organizations are saying for their national audiences, their relationships with the White House, with one another, and so forth. And I think that that kind of scholarship, that vernacular understanding as well of the 60s and its social movements ignores both the transnational elements of those movements, but also something this volume, I think, captures, which is the super local elements of how movements evolve and are experienced. And so one goal that we had here, and many of our authors shared this with us, was to see how the typical stories that get told and recycled about the era's activism might look different when foregrounding the negotiations and clashes with local institutions, the transformations ongoing to local spaces, the specific local boundaries and barriers that were really part of day-to-day lived experience for participants in this one city. Now, that's a task that could be taken for any city, any municipality, but this also raised a more specific question of what was typical and what was unique about St. Louis as the setting for these initiatives, and to go deeper than the kind of surface level journalistic cliches about St. Louis just being a mix of the North and South, which isn't untrue, I don't think, but kind of misses some of the complexities there. And we were really trying to capture that mission or that goal, not to answer the question, but to raise it with our title, Left in the Midwest. Originally, we had the idea for this title to refer to the experience of working and organizing and imagining the world from a particular place in the political spectrum. Activists who are left or allied at least with the left or sometimes part of left liberal coalitions, but what it meant to do it in a specific regional environment of the Midwest. Well, it got pointed out to us that the title could and probably would be misread as meaning left behind or abandoned in the Midwest, left in the Midwest. But actually, when that was pointed out to us, we were pretty happy to realize that the title actually has two potential meanings, because so many of the activists featured in the chapters have noted that St. Louis is a hard place to organize. It was a hard place for them to do their work. And I think that difficulty, a sense of barriers, of pushing against mountains, it's been true in local public memory as well, where so many important social justice campaigns of the past have been forgotten or ignored locally. And so to us, Left in the Midwest as a title kind of gets better than our original conception in its double meaning at what we're going for. The interactions between a particular political sensibility and a particular region, but also the forces of economic precarity facing activists, the obstinate barriers, and something of the subsequent disregard that have faced activist communities here. And I hope many public history projects we're seeing now may be changing at least those forces of disregard in public memory. But more generally, I think focusing on how movements transpire in this specific city brings up a lot of questions about how local environments shape activist upsurges. Like, why in St. Louis were Christian churches so central to the early lesbian and gay liberation movement? How did an interracial direct action group like Percy Green's Action situate itself amid the competing orientations of liberal civil rights integrationists and Black nationalist campaigns ongoing at the time? Why would federal security agencies like the FBI be so invested in the relatively small chapter of Students for a Democratic Society at Washington U, rather than focusing more exclusively on places like Ann Arbor or Berkeley or Madison? Or how did grassroots environmental activists manage to access and ally with local academic scientists and institutions to produce projects like the Baby Tooth Survey or various anti-lead poisoning initiatives? Now, of course, the answers to those questions are internet with the broader national movement histories of this moment. But I also think think they can't really be answered without an intense look at the complex cultural fabric of locality, rooted social networks and community institutions of this moment. So Professor Izzo, my co-editor, and I did our best in the volume introduction to suggest some points that the essays collectively make. I won't really go into these except to list a couple, but some of these include the following. The importance activists placed on remaking city geographies and overlaying new networks of institutions onto the urban terrain. The role of St. Louis's style of conservatism, by which I include both corporate paternalism and a growing radical grassroots right of this moment, in determining how grassroots activists operated, the opportunities they saw, but also the limitations and how they adapted to that set of opponents. Or one could point to a consistent focus across the essays on the connections, the deep connections to earlier local progressive struggles, from earlier generations and moments that survived the pieces that animated and nourished 60s and 70s activist work. And I think that today we'll have a chance to find even more connections among these different chapters, among the different research projects represented here, as we hear from our speakers and consider the stories that they individually, but also perhaps that they collectively have to tell. So let me thank everyone for attending who's in the audience here, and I want to introduce now the four fantastic scholars we have with us. Our first speaker is going to be Luke Ritter, who is an assistant professor at New Mexico Highland University. He's the author of the book, Inventing America's First Immigration Crisis, Political Nativism in the Antebellum West. And Professor Ritter received his PhD in American history from St. Louis U, and he's the author of numerous articles published in distinguished peer-reviewed journals. Our second speaker will be Clarence Lang, who is the Susan Welch Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Professor of African American Studies at the Pennsylvania State University. And Professor Lang is the author of Grassroots at the Gateway, Class Politics and Black Freedom Struggle in St. Louis, 1936 to 75, and Black America in the Shadow of the 60s, Notes on the Civil Rights Movement, Neoliberalism and Politics, along with many journal articles, and he's co-editor of 2 other volumes. Our third speaker today will be Nina Gilden Seavey, who is an Emmy Award-winning documentarian with a 30-year career in the nonfiction world. And she's the founding director of the Documentary Center at the George Washington University, where she's also research professor in history and media and public affairs. And Professor Seavey's documentaries have won numerous awards, including 5 National Emmy nominations, 1 statue of those being awarded, the Eric Barno Prize for Best Historical Film of the Year, and the Peter C. Rollins Prize for Best Film in American Culture. And our fourth speaker, Thomas M. Spencer, is Dean of the Honors College and Professor of History at Texas A&M University, Kingsville. His book, The St. Louis Veiled Prophet Celebration, Power on Parade, 1877 to 1995, is, I believe, undergoing or has undergone a reprinting very recently. And he's also editor and contributor for the anthologies The Other Missouri History, Populists, Prostitutes, and Regular Folk, and The Missouri Mormon Experience. And so we're going to move through the panelists in a roughly chronological way, meaning that we're going to start with the work that focused on earlier periods, and then we're going to move on to work that focuses on later periods of our kind of time span of the late 50s, maybe through late 70s or early 80s. That's the order that we proceed in the book. We've asked each of the panelists to speak for maybe 12 to 15 minutes about the chapter they authored in that research. Then I have just a couple questions that the whole group can answer, but we want to make sure we leave plenty of time before 6 p.m. Central Time for questions from attendees. So we'll really welcome your thoughts and your interaction after these presentations. So I'll turn it over first to Professor Luke Ritter, and the name of his chapter that he's speaking about is The St. Louis Baby Tooth Survey and Women's Environmental Activism. Luke, thank you for being here.
Great. Hello. Today, I want to explore the peculiar and profound relationships between the atom bomb, mothers and milk, baby teeth, and women's environmental activism in St. Louis during the 1950s. Our story begins with an explosion, not just any explosion. You are looking now at and until recently, top secret picture of the largest hydrogen bomb the US Air Force ever detonated. On March 1st, 1954, the team in charge of a nuclear test program on the Bikini Atoll stood in awe for a brief moment. Then they panicked. It was later determined that the blast carried an unexpected explosive yield, nearly 3 times what scientists had predicted. They expected 5 megatons, but the new hydrogen bomb actually yielded 14.7 megatons, which was the equivalent of about 1,000 Hiroshimas. The mushroom cloud spewed radioactive particles into the upper stratosphere, some of which had not existed on the planet before the first successful atom bomb test in the deserts of New Mexico in 1945. The US Navy suddenly evacuated hundreds of natives from islands within 100 miles of the blast as contaminated fallout descended from above, but it was too late for at least 28 Americans and 236 Marshall Islanders. About 300 miles away from Ground Zero, a crew of Japanese fishermen happened right into the path of a concentrated dose of Castle Bravo's radioactive debris. The tragedy made international news. Above ground H-bomb tests, like this one, tested between 1952 and 1962, inspired a generation of Americans to think more critically about the unintended consequences of unleashing dangerous man-made chemicals into the environment. Women played an especially prominent role in raising ecological awareness. In 1958, a group of activists in St. Louis created one of the 20th century's marvels of grassroots environmental science, the baby tooth survey. The nuclear women, as I call them, collected nearly 300,000 baby teeth from across the country for analysis in a lab at Washington University. It's an amazing story. Now, early fallout studies focused on one byproduct in particular, the radioactive isotope strontium-90. For 2 very significant reasons. It has a much longer half-life, 28 years, than any of the other radioactive substances in fallout. This means strontium-90 will emit doses of radiation for the length of a human lifespan, diminishing its radioactivity by half only every 28 years, which ties into the next point. Strontium-90 follows the normal pathways of calcium into the human body. This is why the Atomic Energy Commission conducted a massive analysis of milk supplies from various regions in the United States. The Atomic Energy Commission theorized that strontium-90, which shot high up into the Earth's stratosphere after tests, could circle the world for years before falling to the Earth, perhaps hitching a ride on rain. Strontium-90 particles could then easily be absorbed into the vegetables in the soil, and more importantly, the plants that cows eat. Strontium-90 collects in cow's milk. In the 1950s, milk was Americans' #1 source of calcium, and so it followed it might also be their primary source of this most dangerous radioactive isotope. Just how much strontium-90 got into Americans' diet? Could it cause bone cancer, leukemia, deformities in infants? Willard Libby and the Atomic Energy Commission did not have ready answers to these questions, and since they did not wish the public to panic or the dairy industry to take a dive, they conjured up the most non-threatening name for their fallout study that they could think of. They called it Project Sunshine. Widespread concern in St. Louis escalated when the Public Health Services data revealed that the city was a hot spot, or an area with a relatively high amount of strontium-90 in the milk supply. The early data from 1955 showed that the concentration of SR90 per liter of local milk, or sunshine units, had increased in direct correlation to ensuing nuclear bomb tests, and much faster than in other surveyed cities too. Journalists for the Post-Dispatch pointed out that by the summer of 1959, strontium-90 had become a household word in St. Louis. Ben asked each of us panelists a question about place. So why did this energetic activism take place in the city of St. Louis? So, as I already stated, a Project Sunshine study found high levels of SR90 in St. Louis milk supplies. Secondly, St. Louis had a pronounced history of middle-class women mobilizing for a cleaner city. And my third point, an unparalleled meeting of minds occurred at St. Louis's higher education institutions such as Washington University and St. Louis University during the 1950s. On the second point, these middle-class women occupied a well-defined political niche on most urban matters related to cleanliness, the environment, and health, which dated back at least a century. I mean, before the battle had been against visible contaminants like sewage in rivers or smoke spewing from factory chimneys. Women's predominant role also had a lot to do with the prospect of contaminated milk. Women, after all, were the primary caretakers of young children in the 1950s. Cow's milk had supplanted breast milk as the primary source of nutrients for infants. So many activists came forward as mothers who were concerned about the health and safety of their children. By the way, that's a Geiger counter. This mother is pointing at a bottle of cow's milk she hopes to feed to her hungry infant. Former president of the St. Louis chapter of the League of Women Voters, Edna Gellhorn, pronounced women agreed that they, quote, do not want children to suffer in an experiment to find out how much strontium-90 the human body can tolerate. B. Sherman founded a group with a straightforward name, the St. Louis Women's Committee for Ending Hydrogen Bomb Tests. Some also knew them as the Eves Against Atoms. Bonnie Hart, mother of three, earned the moniker Atomic Lady for her relentless activism against nuclear weapons testing. The Office of Civil Defense at the time issued a family handbook with tips on how mothers might prepare for and survive a nuclear blast. These are fascinating documents. Bonnie Hart cited several absurdities in the civil defense literature, including their suggestion to just use water to wash the radioactive particles away. For Hart, this sheer nonsense indicated at worst a deliberate deception engineered at the highest levels of government, and at best a complete lack of awareness of the impact nuclear fallout would actually have on the broader environment. For this reason, she forbid her daughter, Holly, to participate in the duck and cover drills at school. She was making the point, Holly later remembered, that it didn't matter if we were in the hall or where we were at, or even if we did survive, would we want to survive? Hart did not allow her daughter to drink St. Louis milk as well for the fear of contamination. I had to drink powdered milk, Holly Hart recalled, because of the strontium-90. In spring 1958, the Nuclear Women of St. Louis organized one of the nation's most prominent environmental awareness groups to date, the Greater St. Louis Citizens Committee for Nuclear Information. St. Louis's Committee for Nuclear Information was unique in American history for two very significant reasons. For the first time, it brought together qualified scientific experts and everyday citizens to investigate socially relevant environmental matters. And women played an unparalleled role in forming and directing it precisely for these reasons. Anthropologist Margaret Mead dubbed CNI a new social invention. The first steering committee, led by women, elected biologist activist Barry Commoner as the organization's first president. The CNI immediately began disseminating information to the public about the effects of nuclear fallout through its flagship journal, Nuclear Information. Biologist at Washington University, Florence Moog, contributed an especially influential article in the September issue of 1959. The Post-Dispatch lauded Nuclear Information's lesson that the ecological damage of nuclear fallout alone could be disastrous. Far too many Americans dwelled on the immediate holocaust of blasts, fire, and radiation, when perhaps they should be considering the disruption to the delicate balances of interrelationships which govern the survival of all living organisms. The Committee for Nuclear Information's most important endeavor, however, was the Baby Tooth Survey. In 1958, 9 or 10-year-old residents of St. Louis actually contained a record of strontium-90 uptake in their deciduous teeth, which had formed in utero or during early infancy, precisely during the opening years of A-bomb testing. The Public Health Service awarded several large grants to the Committee for Nuclear Information to fund a world-class lab at Washington University School of Dentistry in cooperation with the School of Dentistry at St. Louis University. It included a massive shield Geiger counter capable of precisely measuring radioactivity in teeth between two 250-pound steel plates, each carved right out of the hull of a decommissioned World War I battleship. Executive directors Louise Rice, then Yvonne Logan, relied heavily on the efforts of volunteer women to spread the word. And that was a vital accomplishment because the scientific advisory group required an estimated 50,000 deciduous teeth per year. Children who donated their teeth to science were asked to fill out a simple form identifying their residential background and age. In exchange, they became members of Operation Tooth Club, complete with an official certificate and a shiny button featuring a smiling child with a missing tooth. Their media campaign targeted children in broadcasts on local children's television programs. In 1960, Mayor Raymond Tucker even declared the week of April 18th Tooth Survey Week. Any child with a wobbly baby tooth is a person of consequence in St. Louis, Missouri, announced Newsweek magazine that year. Once in full swing, the CNI and its tooth survey became a model for science-based public awareness campaigns and women's activism in general. On October 30, 1961, the Soviet Union detonated a huge bomb. In fact, the largest hydrogen bomb ever detonated with a yield of 50 megatons, or 1,570 times the explosive force of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. In response, on November 1st, 1961, a coalition of 50,000 self-proclaimed housewives went on strike in 60 different cities around the country. Protesters protested nuclear weapons in downtown St. Louis. Some of them brought along their children in baby carriages. A couple mothers donned a placard shaped like a milk bottle and topped with a skull, reported the Post-Dispatch, with the caption, "Milk, death, disease, deformity." Many of the anti-nuclear activists embraced the view that women as women were somehow more attuned to nature than the male leaders of the world, more nurturing, more sensitive to environmental change, and thus better peacemakers. The intensifying activism forced another congressional hearing on nuclear fallout in August 1963. At that very moment, August 1963, the baby tooth survey's long-awaited results came in. The Committee for Nuclear Information informed the Joint Congressional Atomic Energy Committee that 12 out of every 3,000 children residing in the states of Nevada and Utah were likely to contract thyroid cancer. The St. Louis Committee report is the first to assert, reported the New York Times, that radiation exposures have reached levels at which there is general medical agreement that physical damage would result. In addition to hearing testimony from St. Louis's CNI, Congress also heard from members of Women's Strike for Peace. Their official statement addressed Congress on behalf of all American mothers and demanded a nuclear test ban at once. President Kennedy signed just such a test ban on August 5th, 1963. And above ground nuclear weapons tests stopped after 1963. It was a good thing too, because one CNI scientist later estimated that if nuclear testing would have occurred at the same rate over the next 3 years, there would have been a 100-fold increase in SR90 absorption by St. Louis one-year-olds. After the test ban, Virginia Brodeen encouraged the group to broaden their scope to other environmental issues. The St. Louis branch of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom also included many early anti-H-bomb activists. In addition to supporting the new ecology, many of the women in Women's International League for Peace and Freedom gradually embraced second wave feminism, creating an amalgamation of activism that linked women and the environment, such that the devastation of the earth became synonymous with the exploitation of women. Along with the new ecology of the 1970s came a string of government regulations protecting the environment. Not only did Americans become more enlightened about the interconnectedness of all things on the planet and the real environmental concerns related to the nuclear industry, but they also recognized women's sustained role in raising consciousness and demanding governmental protections against devastating man-made technologies. As the nuclear women campaigned against environmental hazards, they also discovered a new sense of their place in nature and American society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luke, and I look forward to the opportunity to discuss this as we move on. Our next presenter is Professor Clarence Lang, who's the chapter that he has in the anthology is Black Power on the Ground, Continuity and Rupture in St. Louis. And so Professor Lang will say something about that.
All right. Thumbs up. Can everyone hear me? Okay, good, wonderful. Okay. Well, Ben, thank you for that introduction. Thank you and Amanda for the opportunity to participate in this project with so many wonderful contributing scholars. Really proud to be part of it. And of course, I'm grateful for being invited to join this panel. And I'd be remiss if I didn't thank those of you who are in attendance here to hear us talk about these chapters. With apologies, I don't have slides for you. I'm going to speak from what I'll call a 30-foot level about my chapter in this volume and the scholarly trends that it reflects. And I'd be happy to talk in greater detail about the chapter, but I want to talk more historiographically about how work on St. Louis speaks to issues that are bigger than St. Louis, right? I want to make the case or help make the case of how St. Louis matters as being more than just simply a backdrop to some historical narratives. I should start by saying that I locate myself primarily as an historian of the Black freedom movement. And by that Black freedom movement, I mean the continuous yet evolving struggles that people of African descent in the United States have waged for inclusion, citizenship, democratic participation, autonomy, and self-determination. And for about 2 decades now, scholars in the field of Black freedom studies, as it's been called, have been reframing and redefining the boundaries of what previous generations of scholars have referred to as the modern civil rights movement. And this reframing and redefinition has occurred by revisiting some basic questions about the past. And there are about 4 questions that I just want to sort of put on your radar with the hope of further discussion. The first one being, when did the movement occur? Well, what does that mean, right? The classic, if you will, timeline for the civil rights movement, the so-called modern civil rights movement, had been 1954 to 1965, an historical period marked by, on one end, the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Supreme Court ruling on one hand, and the passage of the Voting Rights Act at the other, with the Civil Rights Act and other developments sprinkled in between. And those are important dates. That's an important 9-year or so period. So it's not about it not being important, if you will. But more recent scholars have expanded that timeline to incorporate the 1930s in terms of the struggles that occurred then, the cross-cutting struggles that occurred, World War II, the early Cold War of the late 1940s and 1950s, which had an impact on many of the themes that Luke was just talking about, and the 1970s, where certainly in my field, people are talking about the renaissance of Black nationalism in its multiple political and cultural forms, which people refer to more generally as Black power, right? So scholars have expanded that timeline. And you know, this is the periodization framework that you will see that I deal with in my chapter. And some scholars have referred to that as a long movement, thinking beyond the traditional historical framework for how we understand the civil rights movement. And in fact, because of expanding that timeline, scholars have argued we need a language that's more inclusive and broader than simply civil rights. So that's the first question. When did it occur? Second, scholars have revisited the question of who were the movement's leaders, participants, and constituents. By that I mean that traditionally, the emphasis had, to some extent still has been, on clergy, members of the respectable Black middle class, and especially males. And let's be clear, those dynamics were at play. That was part of the base, the leadership, the constituency of the movement. But this has changed dramatically in the literature. Scholars have, over the past couple of decades, given more focus on other understudied segments of Black communities, working class people, the poor, other marginal strata, if you will, of Black communities, with a particularly hard emphasis on the multiple, often hidden forms of leadership played by Black women. So we think, for example, in St. Louis, the public housing tenant strike, 1969, really important moment that had national consequences in terms of changing the trajectory of how we talked about in policy circles, in US policy circles, public housing, if you will, welfare, which is a problematic word because building bridges is welfare, but you know, women who were supporting children on aid to do dependent children, so on and so forth, that was a struggle led by Black working class women. Really important historical moment, not just for St. Louis, which is where it occurred, but also nationally. So revisiting this question of who participated, who led, who participated, who were the constituents. Third, scholars have expanded this question of what were the goals? And there, I mean, the literature historically has highlighted Black people's struggle for access to the vote, to public accommodations. If we think, for example, lunch counters and the like, bus transportation, and equal education. And indeed, these were all important and often central goals. But more recent scholars have highlighted what many activists who lived through the period know intuitively and were participating in, have highlighted the presence and significance of battles for fair and full employment, healthcare, equitable urban and metropolitan planning, which was very, very important in St. Louis, given this very fragmented municipal governance and planning structure. So this issue around who participated in the planning of the metropolitan area, very important in St. Louis, but that's not the only place where that occurred. Of course, protection from police misconduct and abuse, which is an ongoing battle that we see today. And certainly in a place like St. Louis, where Black people for a long time had exercised the right to vote. So it wasn't about Black people in St. Louis, Missouri having the right to vote, but it was about the ability to not just simply exercise the vote, but also to exercise the vote meaningfully. Really important point. And indeed, scholars have engaged this issue. If we want to understand or have a broader sense of the goals of the movement, we have to understand Black women's struggle within the movement to be able to exert control over their own reproduction, as well as Black women of color, working class women more generally, the battle around being able to maintain independent and autonomous households, which is a very different way of talking about aid to families with dependent children, right? Not simply the dole, but this was a vehicle for women being able to escape abusive households, to be able to be parents with some dignity and maintain autonomous households. So the agendas of the movement in this approach are actually far more expansive than what previously scholars have understood by simply narrowing the language to civil rights, okay? And the point becomes that the movement's goals were expansive and they were not static. The scholarship tells us, and even activists who participate in the social movements, not to speak for them, but as someone who's been politically active at different points, that when you have a movement, the goals mutate or change over different periods of time in response to both setbacks and victories and location, understanding that expansively. And this brings me to the fourth question that recent scholars in the field have asked. And in fact, this question of the goals is something that I developed in my chapter about Black power and its antecedents in St. Louis in the 20th century. But this idea of location brings me to the fourth question that recent scholars in the field have asked, which is most relevant to this particular volume that Amanda and Ben co-edited. Where did the movement occur? And this might seem like a very elementary question, but it's one that's taken on a great deal of significance. This is pretty vital because the tendency had been in the literature and the scholarship to focus on the South, where the laws and mechanisms of white racial control, exploitation, and oppression of Black people, I'm going to argue, were most sharply articulated and codified, right? So I'm prepared to make that argument that the South historically has been a very particular place. Black people did not pick up and migrate from the South on a whim. There were certainly pull factors, but there were also push factors as well. But of course, we understand that racism historically and presently is national in scope. So the more recent interventions in the literature have involved better understanding how white supremacy has been exercised, but also contested and resisted by Black people outside the South in the Midwest, right, which is characteristic of, in the title of this book, the Northeast, on the West Coast, and in what scholars like myself have identified as the border South. And this may be, I say this at the risk, but it's been published now, so I can say this, but this might make me a bit of an outlier a bit in the volume, because I would argue that that St. Louis and Missouri more generally is typical more of what many of us call the border South than the Midwest, which incorporates states like Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, Maryland, West Virginia. And this is important because I view a place like St. Louis as a microcosm, as a cauldron, as a convergence point of cultures, politics, and social dynamics of the Midwest, but also the Upper South, with all of the contradictions that come with that history. if you'll permit me, I lived for many years in Southern Illinois, spent time in St. Louis, what have you. And I grew up in Chicago, and I think that that's significant for you to know. Because if you ask a Chicagoan where they're located in the nation, they're going to say the Midwest. They may not say Illinois, because if you're from Chicago, you know, Chicago is located in Illinois, but it's not Illinois. But that's a different panel. But you ask people in St. Louis, and I did this, is St. Louis the Midwest or the South? Maybe that's changed in the time since I've lived there, but you would get different answers from people. There were folks who would say it's definitely the Midwest, and others would say, no, this is a southern town. Let's be very clear if we think about the broader history of the state. That's not coincidental, because I think it reflects the conflicted historical identity of that place. The point here, and this is part of the argument that I make in my chapter and have made in the work that I've done on St. Louis, which remains to me a very fascinating and important place, is that to best understand the Black freedom movement, we have to study it regionally and locally. And this is the fundamental point of my chapter by using St. Louis as a primary example. But I want to be clear that I don't look at St. Louis as a mere case study. Indeed, to the contrary, because of its complexities as a collision site between North and South, if you will, St. Louis can help tell a broader story about the movement nationally. It is no coincidence if we think about Ferguson and how that became symbolic of things that were much larger than the suburban fringe of St. Louis. It's not coincidental that this occurred there. I remember when I was a graduate student and then an early career professor working on my book on St. Louis, and a conversation I often had with potential publishers was, well, this is a great topic that you're doing, talking about Black urban communities and working class activism. But I'm not convinced that St. Louis matters. And in fact, you actually study the literature, right? You see that St. Louis historically has been at the center of a lot. It has been a bellwether of many different kinds of trends. Now, of course, once Ferguson occurred, then everyone was contacting me saying, oh, you want to write a book about St. Louis? Now, I changed my mind about this, or what have you. So my point is that St. Louis can help tell a broader story about the movement nationally. And that doesn't just simply apply to my chapter. I think it's just part of the importance of the volume overall. St. Louis is not marginal. In fact, historically, it has been very central to changing dynamics, certainly if we think about race, racism, and the struggles against racism. From that standpoint, I'm really happy about the flourishing of books over the past years. Ben has referred to a few of them, Keona Irvin, David Lukander, the work that they're doing. Walter Johnson's book, The Broken Heart of America, an important book, which locates St. Louis at the center of the nation's intertwined narratives of racism, violence, and exploitation. So the city still, in the state and the region that it reflects, still has a broader story to tell. I'll conclude. I won't test your attention span much longer, but I'll conclude by stating that while a number of my contemporaries in the field are committed to understanding the continuities in the Black freedom movement, i.e., the things that remain constant over time, right? How has Black life and the prospects of that and white racism remained the same over time, continuity? As an historian my own self, I am a lot more interested in the divergences, that is, the changing conditions that Black people have faced over time and how they have pivoted in response to those changing realities, and in doing so have affected the social, political, economic, and cultural landscape. What do I mean by that? That as a historian, it is important to understand how Black people and other peoples who have struggled for progressive change, how they have confronted changing circumstances, made an analysis of the particular period that they're in, and have responded appropriately, which is very different than an argument that racism is simply undistinguishable, unchanging, undifferentiated over time. I do not subscribe to that argument. And if we are committed to progressive change, we have to understand the changing forms of racism. We go back to Frederick Douglass, who talked about how racism is a snake that sheds its skin. And you have to understand the form it takes at different moments. So for me, it's a historical question as an historian, it's a scholarly, of a scholarly importance, but it's also of importance as we think about the prospects for progressive change in our own time, right? Thinking about the particular circumstances that we face in crafting strategies and responses that are suited to that particular moment. So consequently, my chapter discusses how organizations, Black freedom movement organizations in St. Louis ebbed and flowed, in some cases emerged and declined, or if we think, for example, a case like the St. Louis NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, played different roles at different moments. So how the NAACP functioned in the 1950s, when its leadership was rooted in the Teamsters Union, as opposed to later, these are very important differences, and how some leaders and constituents surged to the forefront of the movement at one period. And I'll really listen to this, that you had individuals who surged to the forefront as leaders and constituents at one moment, who were the leading edge, but then at another moment became a fetter or a hindrance to the movement and had to be supplanted by others, right? If we think of how historical change occurs, how some strategies and ideologies that were dormant or subordinate in Black communities at one period, for example, nonviolent direct action versus armed self-defense, became dominant at others, even though they both coexisted at the same time. Though at different moments, one was more dominant than the other. And how the larger landscape, if we think about, for example, changes in a global and national economy, or the responses of the government to the movement, affected the prospects for change as well. So we think, for example, about what did it mean for St. Louis's economy to move from an industrial to a post-industrial economy, the impact that had on communities and the prospects for change. How do we understand the change in the political context and environment, where we've seen since the 1970s, the US government move from, however half-heartedly, a commitment to some social welfare infrastructure to, as we move into our present day, and certainly as someone who was born in the early 1970s, grew up in the 80s and the 90s, the retreat from that culminating in the rise of the carceral state, mass incarceration, which is a consequence in part of the nation's retreat from social welfare to social austerity and punishment. Or if you think, for example, about how St. Louis, at one level, was a leading edge in some innovations in the movement. We can talk about St. Louis being a hard place to organize, but some influential things came out of that. But that also occurred on the other end of the political spectrum. So if we want to understand the new right, the so-called new right that emerged in the late 1960s, Spiro T. Agnew out of Maryland, Patrick Buchanan out of the St. Louis area, right? Wrote for the St. Louis Globe Democrat, the Schlafly family. I like beer, but right? But there were politics behind that, so on and so forth. That this notion of understanding how change matters and how we have to understand how that change occurs, to paraphrase the title of my chapter, on the ground in these local kinds of contexts. I believe I'll stop there. I'm happy to talk at more granular level about the particular chapter that I contributed. And I hope maybe that I've whet your appetite for reading not just that chapter in the book, but also the others. And if I've done that, then I'll consider myself successful. But for the time being, I'll yield. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clarence. We really appreciate that. I have my video off because I've been informed of some instability on the internet on my part. But thank you very much for placing St. Louis in that way and within those historiographical debates. That's such an important context for us. And I hope we can get to that as well as Luke's comments in our discussion. So our third speaker right now is Professor Nina Gilden Seavey. And Nina's chapter in our volume is entitled Surveillance and Subversion of Student Activists, 1967 to 1970, Standoff in St. Louis. And so we'll have Professor Seavey discuss some of the work she did that contributed to that chapter.
So thank you so much, Ben and Amanda. And Amanda, I'm so glad that you were able to join us after all. I take care of a small child, so good for you for figuring that out better than I ever did. So we all, so far, and I think, we all approached our material very differently because we approach, sort of our various examinations of history in different ways. I am a storyteller. And there is a difference between being a storyteller and history. And even though I have a position in both the Department of History and in the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University, I'm sort of bifurcated. And so bifurcated in that sense that Ben and Amanda asked if I would write a sort of a preface to my chapter, because what they did is they said, we want you to explain to what is a traditionally sort of academic audience, sort of how you approach what I would call public history. And so when I began this project, and I'm going to show you a clip, it's what in my world, because I'm a filmmaker, we call sort of a teaser. It's a little bit longer than a trailer. But it's, it usually is used to sell an idea. And I am going to show you the trailer, the teaser that I created to sell what was the idea for this project that then became this chapter. So I'm going to make sure that you can hear it. If somebody can't hear it, stop me. And I'm going to figure this, because sometimes I have found that the audio in Zoom is not always great. So, but we're going for it anyway. And I'm going to turn up my thing. I don't want it to be, okay. So here we go.
No, we don't have audio.
You do not have audio?
Do not.
Nobody has audio?
No
That's
audio.
No, I can't hear it.
No.
That's incredible. So that's even worse than ever, because I'm actually playing this from my computer. So theoretically, you should be able to have, that is unfortunate, because I can hear it fine, but if you can't hear it, then this is useless. That
He just
is there a setting, Miranda?
I'm just checking that.
Yeah, because if it's from my computer, it should be able to be heard by everyone.
It does sometimes have problems.
I've never had no audio. Sometimes people will say it's too loud, which is the reason I turned it up. Oh, that would be
I guess give it
sad.
Give it a try again.
Okay, I'm going to give it a try again.
I
Just
guess
stop.
make sure on your computer it's also turned all the way up.
Yeah, it is
Yeah,
actually.
in microphone, yeah.
Yeah, it is. Both the microphone, yes, it's all turned all the way up. Okay, let's try it again. If not,
I still can't hear.
No. I'm checking the settings.
rats. This is what I do. I show things. I show movies. All right. Well, look, I don't want to stop us from, from being able to move forward.
Can you right click on your microphone button and just check?
I'm going
Ninette?
to do, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do one thing.
Okay.
I have an idea that may work because that doesn't work. But here's what I am going. Okay. Can everybody hear me?
We can hear you talking.
Okay, so this is a different idea. And we will try it this way.
My fellow Americans,
We're
we
good.
have asked for replaced textbooks on some college campuses today. Great universities are being systematically destroyed. Shooting deaths of 4 students at Kent State University aggravated campus tensions elsewhere. Other campus fires burned out an ROTC building at Washington University in St. Louis while students chanted, "Remember Kent."
There were only a handful of civil rights attorneys in the state of Missouri at the time. One of them was my father. So it wasn't too long before the phone at our home began to ring. As the demonstration moved across campus, students were sucked into a tornado of protest that grew into the thousands. The arrest continued over the next few days. One of those was my father's client, Howard Mechanic. Howard was accused of throwing a cherry bomb at a policeman during the riot. Despite his denials, he was sentenced to 5 years in a federal penitentiary on a little-known law that had never been used before or since.
It wasn't a lynch mob, but it was something close to.
This was quite a hotbed of political activity during that time period. You have people who were classified as domestic terrorists. For the FBI, they were a high priority.
We could see signs that he was not going to serve his 5 years, and he was preparing himself to disappear.
Howard became the second longest fugitive in U.S. history. How could this have happened?
One of the charges often leveled against radical groups is that they're communist inspired. What do you mean by that?
Well, we're not communist inspired. We're communists.
You are saying that you are a communist group.
That's right.
Gotta knock those motherfuckers who control this thing right on their ass.
The late J. Edgar Hoover ordered a nationwide campaign to disrupt the activities of the New Left without telling any of his superiors about it.
The Pentagon has joined the Secret Service, the CIA, and the FBI in the undercover investigative business.
There were so many agencies involved in surveillance of anti-war activities that at times spies would trail spies.
Unrestrained, illegal, secret, intimidation, and harassment.
I thought we had a serious problem. I wasn't concerned about people who didn't like the war. I wasn't concerned about people who thought Nixon was allowed. We were talking about bombers. We were talking about assassins. We were talking about snipers. I felt something had to be done.
Again, I wondered, how could this have happened? So I sued the federal government, and I'm here to tell you about it. Okay. Can you hear me again? Okay. All right. So what I would like to talk about today is how I did the research for this project, because something that it took me 10 years to create what essentially became my fugitive, which is now an 8-part podcast that I found out just recently we are trending in Kyrgyzstan for some unknown reason, but it has gone global. And but it all comes down to the research that I did at Washington University, and that's what I really want to talk about. So quite a number of years ago, it must have been about 12 years ago, I contacted an archivist who preceded Miranda, a woman, Carol Prieto, and I asked her for some kind of something that it was related to the flight of Howard Mechanic. As you've learned in this little trailer, my father was Howard's attorney, and there had always been this question as to what had happened in St. Louis that was different than any other place in America, different than, Berkeley or Ann Arbor or Columbia at, New York at Columbia University in New York, or Madison, Wisconsin. Something happened in St. Louis that was so remarkably different that Howard Mechanic and his co-defendants came up on a little known law that had was brought by the Nixon administration from the 1968 Civil Rights Act, called the H. Rap Brown provision. Nowhere else in America had this law ever been used. Before 1968 or since, until the Trump administration inauguration, they used that 1968 law again against those protesters. But on the night of May 4th, 1970, which, as some of you might remember, was the night that the Kent State murders, Howard Mechanic and 3,000 students at Washington University went out and burned down an ROTC building. Nobody ever accused Howard or Larry Cogan or Joel Achtenberg or Napoleon Bland of burning down that building. What they accused them of was, in some cases, sabotage, which was very ambiguous as to what that really was. And in the case of Howard and Larry, they used this 1968 law. So my father, who had been a civil rights attorney and had his own peculiar relationship with the FBI, that bled into our family's life and my relationship with the FBI as I was a child, he always had this question of what had happened in St. Louis and why was it different? So, and I talk about this in the podcast. I hope you listen to the podcast, especially now since people in Kyrgyzstan are listening to the podcast. You definitely should be able to do that. So I began to ask for documents. Howard had became the second longest fugitive in U.S. history, as you found out from the little trailer. He did come up in the year in 1999, 2000, and was ultimately pardoned by Bill Clinton on the last day of the Clinton administration as one of Bill Clinton's last great acts. So here you have a situation where the fugitive has come up, he's been pardoned, but there's still this question of what the hell happened in St. Louis. My father passed away, and I decided to find out. So I went to Carol Prieto, and I went to Sonia first, who I think was on our car at least before. And I said to her, I said, what is it that you can give me? And they gave me a document that had been a senior honors thesis that had been written by a boy, I guess I should say, named Daniel Thomas Gray. And Daniel was one of my historical history department majors at the time. He was 1979, I was 1978, 79. And we were both students of Henry Berger, who was, those of you who know the university, is a, longtime esteemed member of the Department of History. And he was both my advisor as well as Daniel Gray's advisor. Daniel wrote this honors thesis, the senior honors thesis called Birds of Passage. And I read this honors thesis and I thought, this kid was onto something. So I contacted him, because on the internet, you can find anybody. So I contacted him. It turns out that he had tapes that he had made when he interviewed many of the people in 77, 78, 79, when he was writing his thesis. And he was willing to lend them to me. So I started to get interested, and I started to think, well, what about FBI files? So I thought, I'm going to FOIA my father. And so I wrote to the FBI and I said, I wanted all the main files on Lewis Gilden. They write back and they said, we don't have any. I said, I want all of the files on Howard Mechanic, Larry Cogan, Napoleon Bland, Washington University, 1965 to 1975. And I start filing these Freedom of Information Act requests. At the same time, Miranda very graciously dug out of the Dan Boliv papers and other papers of the university FBI files that had been donated to the university. It was kind of a thing in the late 70s, early 80s for people who had been students in the 60s and 70s to request their FBI file. So they started feeding me these files. Meanwhile, the FBI is continuing to deny my requests. They either say I don't have, that the files are too large, such as in the case of Howard Mechanic, or I wasn't doing something of national importance, so they didn't want to bother with me. So I did what the daughter of a good attorney does. I hired an attorney. A man named Jeffrey Light, who is one of the foremost FOIA attorneys in the United States, who took my case on pro bono. He knew of my father's work in the Supreme Court on behalf of Percy Green. And he felt that, we were going to win the case and he would get paid by the government, which in fact is what happened. But at the time but he's just like a sole practitioner. So I acted as my own paralegal, and he said, here's what I want you to do. All of those FBI files that Miranda gave you and some of the other co-defendants, because I started calling people. I started saying, I used my maiden name, Gilden, and I said, hi, I'm Lou Gilden's daughter. I'm doing this. Everybody wanted to help. So if they had their FBI file, they sent it to me. And then many of them I got I received from Miranda. So Jeff told me to do one thing. He said, I want you to go to the bottom of every page, and I want you to pull the numbers off of those pages, even if it doesn't have an identifier, because those are main files of the FBI. So we filed suit in 2015. So now we're talking 5 years after I contacted Carol Prieto, and 4 years since I started filing these FOIA requests. And we filed lawsuit, Seavey v. Department of Justice et al. We sued the FBI, the CIA, the Department of the National Archives, because a lot of these documents had been transferred to the National Archives. And under a separate action, we sued the Department of the Army. So the CIA said, we have nothing. And the CIA, which was running Operation Chaos on the Washington University campus, had been instructed by Congress to burn all of their files, to destroy all of the files. Do we actually believe that they destroyed the files? No, they had a computer that they called Hydra. And I don't believe that they destroyed the contents of Hydra, but that was a much bigger problem of infiltration into government records than I was going to be able to do in my lifetime. So we focused more on the FBI and on the National Archives. The National Archives, and listen, in deference to Miranda, Carol, and Sonia, I love archivists. But the National Archives was very, very upset that I sued them. Unfortunately, at the National Archives, and this has only gotten worse today, they are currently, at that time, they had a 4-year wait between the time that you submitted a request to them and the time that they could even consider the request. So it is the FOIA's office in the National Archives' job to go through every page and make sure that there are 2 things that are no longer, that are redacted. One is the name of confidential informants, and the other is anything having to do with a grand jury proceeding. So before they can even do that review, there was a 4-year wait. So the FBI said, we'll see you in court. The National Archives said, we want to talk to you. So my attorney and I went to the Department of Justice and sat down across the table from all of these wonderful archivists whose feelings you could tell were really hurt that I was doing this. And they tried to appeal to my better sense of justice. And they said, it's wrong for you to put yourself to the head of the queue. Think of all these other people who've been waiting in the queue 3 and 4 years, and we're just now getting to their request. And I'm like, I'm really sorry, but I think everybody needs to sue you, because you will go to Congress and you will ask for more money, because a 4-year wait is absolutely unacceptable. So they left there, and it was a sad day for everybody, because I would never, Miranda, ever want to say a bad word to an archivist, because you are the holder of the golden keys for all of us. So we filed suit in 2015, and in 2017 which you have to remember was right in the middle of the Trump administration. And the judge said, it is more important now than ever that we know what our government is up to. And she released 150,000 pages of documents to me. I received them in batches of 3,000 at a time. I went through every single one of them over a 3-year period. I annotated them, and I built a database that became the foundation of what then became this podcast, My Fugitive. Now, one might ask, and I'm going to turn it over immediately, because I want to make sure that my good friend Thomas Spencer gets his chance, and we're already over time. But here's what happened. I released My Fugitive, having learned that what happened to the students at Washington University was in fact singular to St. Louis. But it was also tied by the FBI to the assassination investigation of Dr. Martin Luther King. Hence, I did not make a film, but I did a podcast that covered everything from what happened to poor old Howard Mechanic all the way through to what I was able to reveal about the assassination investigation of Martin Luther King, working at that time with Robert Blakey, who was the chief counsel for the House Committee on Assassinations. So it turned out to be a very large project. And for this part of it, I pulled out episodes 1, 4, 5, and 6, and 8, and wrote about the surveillance and subversion of students in St. Louis and what specifically happened to Howard Mechanic and Larry Cogan and Napoleon Bland, Joe Eisenberg, and Joel Achtenberg. I have now donated that 150,000 pages of documents to Washington University. And they are accessible online for people for other researchers, because I came across a lot that I couldn't do anything with, a lot that had to do with Barry Commoner and the Center for Nuclear Information and the Baby Tooth Survey, and Yvonne Logan and Edna Gellhorn, which I'm looking into now. And also, I am now doing a 4-part television series called The Plot to Kill a King, which is about what I found on just the King material. So it just talks to research process. It doesn't talk about, I mean, the trailer told you a little bit, but what happened in St. Louis was a crime by the government. And unfortunately, the protesters on May 4th, 1970, fell into a trap. And they were made an example of. So anyway, I'm going to stop there, listen to My Fugitive, and like I said, I'm in total love and devotion to archivists in spite of what I did to them. The wait, by the way, right now is 9 years. I just wrote an article for the Chronicle of Higher Education about that. So at NARA. Anyway.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Seavey. And I hope we'll have a chance to take audience questions on some of the discoveries that you made in working with those 150,000 documents. But it's great to know that the podcast is there for people who want to know more. And if you want to put there is a link now in the chat box that's available. So thank you, Miranda, for that. Our fourth and final presentation before we get to some audience Q&A, and I think after this one, we'll go directly to audience questions. I'll forego the ones that I might have had. But our final presentation before Q&A is from Professor Thomas Spencer. And the title of this chapter is Whacking the Elephant Where It Hurts, the Veiled Prophet Organization, Action and Economic Justice in St. Louis, 1965 to 1980. So thank you for being with us as well, Tom.
All right. Well, this is great. I do have to say that as the poor grad student working on a dissertation in the late 90s, I always wanted to go look at the COINTELPRO documents for Action. And I got a hold of a couple of them, so I could make a couple of generalizations about it, but I was never able to do as much as I probably would like to. And now it would probably take 9 years. So anyway, what I'm going to do is, this is like a distilled down version, of my chapter. I just want to cover like the main points, and I'm going to also have a PowerPoint that gives you some pretty pictures. I have to share it though. Hang on. I always have to remember to do this in the right order. Okay. All right, there we go. That should be there. Okay. Now, what I want to talk about here is, I opened this chapter with this sort of dramatic rendering of the unveiling of the prophet, and two different activists, literally, it's 10:30 on December 22nd of 1972. They create a big scene in the Kiel Auditorium. At one point, one of the activists slides down essentially a cable. Gina Scott, and she pulls the veil off, the veiled prophet, in front of probably 4,000 people. And you know, it's the guy, the Vail prophet at the time was a fellow named Tom K. Smith, executive vice president for the Monsanto company. And it's like when that veil comes off, every journalist, every photojournalist in the room takes a picture. And then many months later, it comes out in the St. Louis Journalism Review, which tells you about the sort of the power of that organization. The unveiling of this veiled prophet was sort of the crowning achievement of the civil rights group Action from 1965 to 1984. And again, I've really distilled this down, so I'm really kind of covering the bare bones here. And where's my slide again? There we go. And you know, while this may seem kind of frivolous, the issues involved, which was economic justice in the form of jobs for minorities, were very serious. Despite their denials, the Veiled Prophet organization clearly found it necessary to respond to this challenge. And over the next several years, many major changes actually happened in the Veiled Prophet organization. So I'm just going to kind of, you know, I'll give you a background to Action and then talk about all of that. Whoops, wrong slide. And so let's see, let me get my little thing here. Action, which stood for the Action Committee to Improve Opportunities for Negroes, was an unusual organization in the late 60s. The group's goals represented a sort of practical middle ground, was neither accommodationist nor nationalist. The story of Action offers a local case study of a group that was ahead of its time in emphasizing economic opportunities and employing theater of confrontation tactics. Action was an exception to many of the generalizations that have been made about civil rights groups during this period. And unlike other organizations, this group remained integrated and viewed white members as an asset. While national civil rights groups, you know, like CORE and SNCC were, you know, expelling white members and, you know, doing those sorts of things, Action did not do that. A more economically centered and practical set of goals. Founded by Percy Green and a few members of CORE's Employment Committee in April of 1965, Action was, in Green's words, quote, committed to direct action protest, by which he meant confrontation with specific opponents with specific goals in mind. The St. Louis Jefferson Bank protests in 1963 had divided the St. Louis chapter of CORE. The chapter subsequently abandoned the idea of a direct action protest. Green and several members of the Employment Committee, a growing faction inside of CORE that called for more direct action, felt betrayed. CORE was apprehensive, Green told a reporter in 1970. The members had battle fatigue or something, I guess. We needed a group that would be a spark for change. Action's primary goal, in the words of former member Jane Sauer, a white female, was, quote, to obliterate Action through economic justice, through jobs, and through communication with the upper echelons of St. Louis in order to promote change. Specifically, Action advocated for more and better paying jobs for Black men. As Percy Green explained, the members of Action, quote, thought that you could cut down on the risk factor of Black men running the risk of committing burglaries, cut down on the criminal approach, and getting money to feed their families. Members of Action believed that Blacks had a right to equal and well-paying employment opportunities, which was central to a good quality of life. Sauer explained Action's economic views this way. It's up to you whether you want to buy a house, but you have a right to have a job that will let you buy that house. It's your right to have a grocery store that has better produce. You have a right to own a car, shop wherever you want. And the only way to have these things is to have a job. So Action's struggle was for economic rights rather than just simply civil rights. And for Action activists, civil rights coexisted with economic rights, and African Americans needed the civil rights legislation passed in the 60s, but this legislation meant little if they could not find the jobs to sustain themselves. For Action activists, civil rights okay, so I got that. All members of Action had to agree to one thing. The organization would have Black leadership. Green felt that Black folks had the right to make mistakes for Black people rather than to have white people make those mistakes for them. Whites certainly did play integral roles in the organization, but a Black leadership made important decisions. As Green said, quote, one way to find out whether one was still tainted with racism was if one could accept Black leadership. In fact, Action members believed that Black leadership was therapeutic for whites. In addition to protesting at the Veil Prophet Ball and Parade, Action tried to achieve economic and social justice through protests at large corporations. They targeted these employers because, unlike smaller employers, they were not driven out of business by a successful protest. And again, Action members were lots of different people. It included white Washington University professors, former Wobblies, young college-educated women, young Black men and women still in high school, as well as men and women of nearly every conceivable age and many different ethnicities. Now, nevertheless, Action never grew to be very large. At most, it probably had an active membership of 50 to 100 people. There were also lots of unofficial members, members of Washington University's faculty or administration, who would actually send in contributions. Action consistently had more Black members than white members. White members made up between 35 and 40%. In summing up Action's activities, and this is about the Veil Prophet, Barbara Torrance asserted that the group's members, quote, found it relatively easy to get appointments with the CEOs of companies, but it's really hard to get anything beyond that. You know the old joke about the elephant. First, you've got to get his attention, and to get his attention, you have to whack him where it hurts after you've tried everything else. One of the better ways Action found to whack the elephant where it hurts was attacking for something that the elephant held dear, and that was the Veil Prophet organization, parade, and ball. In contrast to the recently founded Action, Veil Prophet organization had been a St. Louis institution for nearly a century by 1872, fashioning themselves after the New Orleans Carnival Society, the Mystic Crew of Comus, a group of prominent white St. Louisans founded the Veil Prophet in 1878. The Veil Prophet organization formed again in response to a general strike by workers the summer before. A Veil Prophet or Grand Oracle, they often would just say the GO. Even when I was talking to them in the 90s, they still did that. It is not publicly known how the Veil Prophet was chosen, just that he was a local businessman. For most members of Action, the Veiled Prophet celebration symbolized racism and white control of St. Louis's economy. Members of the Veiled Prophet organization held the purse strings at these corporations. Jane Sauer believed, quote, the VP embodied the white power structure of the city. It involved their children. It really did. The white male heads of state, heads of corporations, city fathers, the whole myth of city gentry, the whole myth of an establishment, of regalness, of blue-bloodedness. It was the figurehead of everything we were against. And it was for many years a white Anglo-Episcopalian thing to do. So the Veil Prophet was the perfect target for Action for both tactical and strategic reasons. Protests against the Veil Prophet would draw a lot of media attention. Sauer felt like the Veil Prophet was, quote, was like a precious child of the city. Because of that, it was something the media wanted to defend. Of course, the editors also wanted their tickets, and it was a big social deal. Action also targeted the Veil Prophet parade and ball because it furthered their goals of more jobs for Black men. Many activists viewed the protest as the way to hit all the CEOs at once. Mm-hmm. From 1965 to 1976, Action protested the Veil Prophet celebration every year. Most of those protests were picketing the ball and disrupting the parade. Typically, a group of Action members disrupted the parade by laying down in front of parade floats while other activists passed out leaflets. For instance, members would act out a scene, maybe being doctors of social healing in the street in front of the floats until they could get arrested. On a few occasions, they chained themselves to floats. They would get arrested for, disturbing the peace. Action's other public statements made it clear that the Veil Prophet organization used Kiel Auditorium for the Veil Prophet Ball. The city's political leaders were closely attached to the white power structure. Quote, the Veil Prophet symbolized the power they had access to at public expense, end quote, said Margaret Phillips, who is on this Zoom call. I have just now noticed, or I noticed a couple hours ago. It's good to see you, Margaret. Quote, that was a big point. For years, they did it in the Veil Prophet Ball at the Kiel Auditorium, a taxpayer-supported auditorium. Many Action members believe one of their greatest achievements was getting people just to realize that, and to realize that their tax dollars was supporting this organization, and that there was a whole bunch of tax money being spent on police protection. Action ultimately wanted two things. They wanted the CEOs of the Veil Profit Organization to hire more minority workers. Second, they wanted the Veil Profit Organization to disband. They felt the money spent on this celebration, both public and private, would be better spent on something more helpful for the community. The approach to the Veil Profit varied. There would be picketing, veiled profits, or VP equals KKK, all sorts of things like this that they would do at the ball. And so between 1965 and 84, Action continued to disrupt the parade and picket the ball. The Veil Prophet did several things in reaction. First, the Veil Prophet Queen and maids were taken out of the parade after 1967. This move was an expression of concern. In 1968, the parade no longer really went into downtown St. Louis at that time. I think it would return later in the 90s, but at that point it didn't. It would stay in the central West End. And the parade would avoid African-American neighborhoods. In 1969, the parade moved to the daytime. There was even a period of 4 or 5 years where the VP wasn't in it. And the move to daytime was directly connected to Action's protests. As Bob Tooley, who built the floats for the Veil Prophet, said, the parade was moved to the daytime because, quote, we started having an awful lot of trouble at night, a lot of protests and so forth. And in fact, the animosity was reaching a fever pitch by 1968, when, according to Tooley, quote, one of the drivers who was driving the float said he remembered seeing something sailing through the air, looked like a pie pan, and he woke up in the hospital with 14 stitches. And now that's no evidence that Action had anything to do with that. By the way, all the way through the history of that Veil Prophet parade, the people on the floats were targets. In fact, they used to always wear masks. Things, and you could find that back to the 1880s. The organization also made changes in the ball. Beginning in 1970, the ball was moved to the Friday night before Christmas. The change in the date sort of disassociated it from the parade in October, and it was becoming, the ball was becoming, was viewed as this sort of tasteless excess. And so by moving it to that time period, it got less attention. In November 1973, Action filed a class action lawsuit claiming that the city's rental of the Kiel Auditorium for the Veil Prophet Ball was tantamount to renting a public building as a private club. Shortly afterwards, the organization moved the ball from the Kiel Auditorium to the Chase Park Plaza Hotel. And of course, the Action folks said, well, this is a bit of a victory. But by moving to a private facility, the Veil Prophet took away, this hey, this is a, tax dollars going to a private organization. They also began to pay for security. They essentially, insulated themselves from some of these criticisms. In 1979, the Veil Prophet organization allowed its first Black members, 3 doctors, to join. Ronald Hinges, a longtime Veil Prophet organization, argued there was no connection between these changes and Action's protests. I don't believe the protests, this is my quote, obviously, I don't believe the protests, I don't believe Percy Green influenced the organization in any way. We just got more security. He got publicity, that's what he wanted. As far as influencing any change in the VP, Percy Green can't take any credit for that. This is obviously Ronald Hinges' viewpoint. Although the St. Louis Press believe there's a connection between this decision and Action's protests. They called Action headquarters that day, and said, look, they've admitted Black members. When asked about the day, Jacqueline Bell, a member at the time, said, the press called us down there saying Action will no longer be protesting, right? Because they've admitted Black members. And I said, hey, you guys missed the point. We weren't trying to integrate the damn thing. You missed entirely what we were trying to do. The miscommunication of Action's pro-employment message was symptomatic of the press coverage at the time, even though every protest had, very clear statements of employment goals and economic things. Frequently, the coverage was just, you could not tell what they were protesting. The Globe Democrat published many damning editorials about, condemning Action, written by, minor people like Pat Buchanan, who then worked for the paper. Did actions protests ultimately improve employment opportunities? Green, at the time I talked to him in the mid-90s, did not think so. I talked to him 5 or 6 years later, and he felt a little differently. But he believed, quote, these individual companies still carried on racial discriminatory practices, although not to the same degree as before. The level of tokenism is going up, but that's not to say they're fair in their practices. However, actions protests did change employment practices at some companies, and you would see some of that. When the veil profit protests may have done little to further actions employment bills, these protests showed many St. Louisans that their tax dollars were supporting an elitist and at the time racist institution. And that was something that was fairly widely believed at the time. Now, I want to say a little bit about what happened a couple of years ago, which you may have heard about or you may not have. But in May of 2021, the veil profit was suddenly discovered by the national media when someone on Twitter mentioned that Ellie Kemper, a well-known comedic actress from St. Louis, had been the 1999 Queen of Love and Beauty in the Veil Profit Ball. What followed was a really bizarre social media episode in which some on Twitter asked brilliant questions like, quote, was Ellie Kemper a KKK queen? Okay. It is very disturbing to have your work Twitterized in such a manner. This complicated, painstaking historical narrative gets boiled down to 280 characters. You don't want to know how much my phone rang and who I talked to, because I was the one person, who had written something about this. I got contacted by Fox News at one point. We're going to run your quote. And I went, okay, well, please don't do that anymore. Ultimately, Kemper apologized for taking part in the event, put the entire thing to bed as far as that was concerned. When I was interviewed by people about it, I said, it's kind of silly to criticize a 19-year-old for doing something to please her dad. That's just what I said. And I think that's true, However, the national public media scrutiny put the organization into significant turmoil. The Veil Profit Parade, Ball, and Fair had not changed really in 20 years. In July of 2021, the organization hastily took the Veiled Prophet and the Queen of Love and Beauty out of the parade, made a lot of vague promises about how they would reform the organization, which had only continued to exist because it was a great place to make business contacts. Many members spoke to the St. Louis media anonymously, claiming they were embarrassed that the Veil Prophet character still existed and that the organization did not do enough community charity work. And as some of the journalists in St. Louis at the time pointed out, from 2014 to 2018, the organization's annual spending averaged $830,000 on the ball, $860,000 on the parade, $400,000 on members-only meetings, and their community service foundation spent less than $100,000 annually. Many members of the organization, particularly those in the tech sector, were concerned their employees might find out they were members. These executives worried that they might lose their younger, more socially progressive employees. What all these developments mean for the future isn't clear, but judging from these stories, they're apparently, they said they were going to make some major changes. So that's like the world's fastest version of that chapter. There's a lot more to it. But that's, I guess that's what I have to say about it. I did have other illustrations. Yeah, this is like what the original Veil Prophet, it's a whole lot like a Klan member. These are a couple of illustrations of the parade, the ball, some protests. And again, this is the conclusion. So, all right, I will stop the share and we should go to questions.
Let me thank you for your great talk that really fleshes out some of the landscapes that we've been looking at. And I think if I could turn it over to you, Miranda, to kind of moderate what we're seeing in the chat box, or people who might want to unmute themselves and ask a question.
Yeah, do we have anyone on the call who'd like to pose a question to the panel? Feel free to go for it.
Ben, you should ask your question. Get people started.
Well, I'd like to elicit some from the audience while we have a few minutes left.
Yeah.
Nobody? Okay, well, I was interested, if I could go ahead. Where is that now? I was interested, it seems like in all of the talks and in many of the chapters within the book, the kind of troubled and difficult, but sometimes successful and fulfilling process of coalition building seems really central. How do groups form coalitions or fail to do so across lines of class, of gender, in some of the other chapters of sexuality, certainly of political ideology, liberals and leftists sometimes at odds and sometimes working together. And so I wonder if anybody could talk about the work that was kind of peculiar to St. Louis in trying to forge coalitions. What made that either more difficult in the work that you did or easier about the kind of regional dynamics of the area and how that transpired? In other words, are there particular facets of the local environment that either impeded or propelled the kinds of coalitional work that groups were trying, sometimes with success and sometimes with failure, to pull off?
Clarence, it seems like that's something you would know a lot about.
I think I see Luke's hand. Luke, looked like you were going to talk to that, speak to that.
Yeah, just a quick thing. One of the things I noticed with the environmental activism is that many of the organizers decided to sort of forego strong stances on politically controversial topics. And the idea was, if we're going to build the strongest possible coalition, we should sort of skirt around the sensitive topics. And during the time of the Cold War, when they could, they stood to be accused of communism or somehow aiding the Russians, they did their best. They did their best to keep the sort of Cold War politics out of it and focus instead on the science and the facts that could be uncovered. And I think that was remarkably successful. They were able to pull in people from all different kinds of political sides of the aisle. And I don't know, I'm not going to speak more generally to St. Louis, but I think that was probably necessary in that city in order to get any kind of big coalition going. So.
Ben, can I bump your question? I saw something in the chat here from Logan Phillips. Being that this work was very much grounded in community organizing, from your perspective as scholars, how did you all stay engaged within Build Connection and St. Louis communities in the research process? So yeah, I can only speak for myself. I got interested in Black social movements in St. Louis because as an MA student at Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville across the river, got involved in a local community organization in St. Louis. And a lot of the conversation was about how difficult it was to organize in St. Louis. And indeed, that was not untrue. And so as I tried to merge my interest in social change and research, I began studying about St. Louis and discovered that actually it was a long and very robust tradition that I think a lot of people probably still don't quite appreciate. And so I say that to say that my research was really born of engagement and trying to make change. And I had gone to the University of Missouri at Columbia and was involved at a different period, well before the events, obviously following the shooting of Michael Brown. And that organization, the Organization for Black Struggle, actually became pretty significant in the Ferguson struggles many years later, after I had left the area and gone off to my career and what have you. So, but I like that question because, for me, at least, there was an iterative process to some commitments that I had, but also wanting to better understand the world as a scholar, with the idea of aiding the process of changing the world, which sounds naive, but that's how I approach things, and to some extent still do.
I think for me, it was different because students on college campus, they live together. There's no impediment to organizing on a college campus because, especially in the 60s and 70s, students were living on campus or living, on Rosebury or down in the Loop or wherever, they were, having pot parties and, co-ops and, potluck dinners, most of which had been infiltrated by the FBI. In that sense, there's one part of my, just in terms of organization. And again, this is a little bit different because it does go to this issue of FBI infiltration. The Army ROTC building on the Washington University campus was burned in 1970, in February of 1970. And there were 12 men who spontaneously decided to do something, and they firebombed the Army ROTC building and burned it to the ground. It was one of two events having to do with that ROTC building that enraged J. Edgar Hoover and impelled this trap that occurred in St. Louis. But the level of infiltration by the FBI and having, obviously affected so much of the organizing ability of the students whose, literal, I have documents where there would be 4 people watching late night television, eating potato chips, and one of them was an informant. So the impediments to organizing in my chapter is very different because, college students, are all about grouping themselves together, but it was the goal at that time of the Department of the FBI, the Department of the Army, the CIA, the DIA, the NSA, the CIA. Literally an alphabet soup of agencies to try to keep them from organizing. So a different thought about that.
Would anyone else like to respond to the question that I believe Logan Phillips asked that Clarence took first about kind of connections to current communities, including activist communities in St. Louis? And I think, one way we could move with that question also would be to think about the lessons you think your chapters should impart to progressive activists of the present day, but also the lessons that, as Clarence spoke to, you may take from activists in the present day as we seek to look at the past.
Beware. The government knows everything. That's cynical. I'm not gonna, don't listen to me.
Well, and I think one of the lessons that I saw was just that, it was frustrating because I had, I talked with lots of people, literally 20 people, and, transcribed the interviews, and it was and everything you would read was very clear what the organization wanted, and the media seemed to just self-consciously cloud that, so you just could not, and in fact, as you get later into the 70s and the 80s, that didn't get any better. And it was, I can only imagine. I mean, Percy was very frustrated in the mid-90s when I was talking to him about it, and I'm sure he still is. But it's just one of those things where, they did, that I would say the organization did everything they could to clearly transmit what they were doing. It's just, and I don't know if there was a way for them to do it with the fairly, I guess you would say, biased white press at the time.
I think the other thing, though, about action in particular, is that a lot of what they did was pretty, it was not direct action as you would necessarily characterize it. A lot of it were pranks. And, and actually Percy recounts one of those pranks in My Fugitive. But I think also the other part of it is that, you know, when he threw green dye in the Wonder Bread mixture. I mean, there were things that they did that didn't seem like direct action that people understood as having to do with economic opportunity or racial equality or some of the other sort of loftier notions. I mean, they were, you know, I mean, in that sense, he was seen as a prankster. And so I think it was, sometimes it muddied the message.
Well, yeah, especially when you're talking about later on with what they called the cry-in against racism, where they go into and this is, you know, toward the end of it, but would spray tear gas at the ball, you know.
Right.
And that's the sort of thing. It got attention, and let me tell you that very much so. But yeah, and unfortunately, that's the messaging. Yeah, does get muddy. You're right.
Well, clearly, very many topics that I hope everybody will look for the book. Earlier in the chat, Lauren shared a PDF flyer that offers a discount if you are interested in purchasing a copy. And thank you, Lauren, for sharing that again. Of course, as a librarian, I have to also say to consult your local library. I think it'd be a great addition to your local library if it's not there, to talk to your librarian. And thank you all very much for being part of this panel, for joining with questions. As Ben mentioned, there is another event coming up from Left in the Midwest, which I am incredibly heartbroken to not be able to be at. It will be in what was the former Mill Creek Valley, which is now on the campus of St. Louis University, and promises to be a wonderful event if you are in St. Louis and can attend that at home. I hope you check that out. There's some registration information. Thank you all. I know we're running a little over time. Eventually, the recording of this will be shared out from the Washington University Library's YouTube channel, and I will also follow up with an email to everyone who registered for the talk so you can have that. And thank you all again. Ben, anything else you'd like to say?
No, I just really want to thank the four contributors here for excellent talks that really build outwards on the context of the chapters that they offered. But if you haven't checked out their chapters, check those out, because they're four fantastic pieces of scholarship that are worth many rereadings. And when you're the editor of a volume, you do many rereadings as you put things together. And every time I engage with any one of these four chapters, I pulled something new out of it. I got something new out. So thank you very much for the contributions in writing, and now especially in person, everyone.
And thank you, Ben and Amanda and Miranda, for putting the volume and this panel together.
Indeed. Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
You well.
You too.